When 28-year-old Rachel Torres signed the final paperwork to assume ownership of her grandfather's struggling auto repair shop, she expected nothing more than grease-stained floors and outdated equipment. But hidden beneath a welded-shut tool chest in the back workshop lay a leather-bound war diary that would expose a 50-year military cover-up and force a reckoning with one of the most decorated generals in American history. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow I've got something even more powerful lined up for you. The Arizona sun blazed mercilessly over the cracked asphalt of Torres Auto Repair, casting sharp shadows across a single-bay garage that had been a fixture on the outskirts of Copper Ridge since 1975. Rachel Torres stood in the doorway of the cinder block building, her work boots crunching on gravel as she surveyed the chaos of her unexpected inheritance. Rusted toolboxes stacked haphazardly against oil-stained walls, ancient hydraulic lifts that groaned under their own weight, and a sprawling collection of classic car parts that belonged in a museum rather than a functioning auto repair business. The metal sign above the entrance, once painted in bright red and gold, had faded to a dull orange, the letters barely legible. Torres Auto Repair, transmissions our specialty, since 1975. A smaller sign beneath it, hand-painted in weather-beaten, read, Miguel Torres, Proprietor. At 28, Rachel had built a solid reputation as a diesel mechanic for Southwestern Freight Lines, one of only 3 women in a maintenance crew of 47 men. She'd fought hard for respect in a ruthlessly male-dominated field, earning it through relentless 12-hour shifts, weekend overtime, and an encyclopedic knowledge of engine systems that left even the most skeptical old-timers nodding in grudging approval. She could diagnose a failing turbocharger by sound alone, could rebuild a Cummins ISX-15 engine blindfolded, and had once kept a broken-down rig running with nothing but duct tape and wire until it limped into the depot. But this? Standing in front of her grandfather's legacy, feeling the weight of expectation and history pressing down on her shoulders? This was entirely different territory. Her grandfather, Miguel Antonio Torres, had passed away 3 weeks ago at 89, his heart finally giving out after carrying him through nearly 9 decades of hard living, hard work, and harder memories. He'd left behind a business drowning in $85,000 of accumulated debt, outdated equipment that barely functioned, and a reputation as the best transmission specialist Copper Ridge County had ever known. The funeral had been extraordinary. Hundreds of people had attended, far more than Rachel had expected for a man who'd spent the last 15 years of his life as a recluse, rarely leaving the shop, barely speaking to anyone except his regular customers. Old men in their 70s and 80s had approached Rachel with tears in their eyes, gripping her hands with calloused fingers, telling stories about how Miguel had kept their work trucks running when they couldn't afford dealership prices, how he'd extended credit during hard times, how he'd taught their sons and grandsons the dignity of honest work. Fellow veterans from the Korean War had formed an honor guard, their aging bodies standing at attention one final time for a brother in arms. Community members who remembered when Torres Auto Repair had been the beating heart of this now dying strip of highway had lined up to pay respects to a man who'd represented a vanishing era. Rachel's mother, Carmen, had been characteristically blunt during the will reading at the attorney's office downtown. She'd sat rigid in her chair, her designer handbag clutched in her lap, her expression a mixture of grief and exasperation. "Sell it," Carmen had said flatly, her voice cutting through the attorney's dry recitation of assets and liabilities. "Liquidate everything. The building, the equipment, whatever parts have any value. Pay down the debts as much as you can and walk away. You can't save a business that's been hemorrhaging money for 15 years, Rachel. It's not possible." Her mother wasn't wrong. The numbers didn't lie, and Carmen Torres Vasquez had always been pragmatic to a fault. The financial statements the attorney had provided painted a grim picture, declining revenue every year since 2010, mounting debts to parts suppliers, overdue property taxes, equipment that needed replacement but couldn't be afforded. The business hadn't turned a profit since Barack Obama's first term. The building needed a new roof. The hydraulic lifts were safety hazards. The customer base had shrunk to a handful of loyal holdouts who kept coming back more out of loyalty to Miguel's memory than confidence in the service. Big chain auto shops with their sterile waiting rooms and corporate pricing had systematically siphoned away the reliable customers. Younger car owners went to dealerships with their computerized diagnostic equipment and factory-trained technicians. Independent shops like Torres Auto Repair were dinosaurs, relics of an automotive era that no longer existed. Mom's right, Rachel's older brother, Daniel, had added during the drive back from the attorney's office. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, wore expensive suits, drove a leased BMW, and had made it abundantly clear over the years that he considered manual labor beneath him. Cut your losses. You've got a good job with Southwestern. Benefits, steady paycheck, room for advancement. Don't throw that away trying to resurrect a dead business out of some misguided sense of obligation. Logic said they were right. Every rational calculation pointed toward liquidation. Walk away, let the bank foreclose, wash her hands of the whole mess. But Rachel remembered something else about this place, memories that had nothing to do with balance sheets or profit margins. She remembered summer afternoons when she was 8 years old, sitting cross-legged on a rolling mechanic's stool while Grandpa Miguel taught her to gap spark plugs with a feeler gauge, his rough hands guiding hers with infinite patience. The smell of motor oil and brake cleaner, the sound of norteño music playing on the ancient paint-splattered radio, the way afternoon sunlight slanted through the grimy windows and made the floating dust particles look like gold. She remembered being 11 and watching her grandfather diagnose a misfiring engine by listening to it idle, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly, as if the machine were whispering its secrets directly into his ear. Then he'd opened his eyes, pointed to cylinder number 3, and been absolutely correct. She remembered being 16, the summer before her junior year of high school, spending every day in the shop while her friends were at the mall or the movies. Her grandfather had given her a disassembled carburetor and a shop manual, then left her alone to figure it out. It had taken her 2 days of frustration and skinned knuckles, but she'd done it. When the engine fired up smooth and perfect, her grandfather had looked at her with an expression she'd never forget. "You've got the gift, Mija," he'd told her, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. "Not many people can listen to what a machine is trying to say. Most people just hear noise. You hear the language. That's special. Don't let anyone tell you different." Those words had carried her through tech school, through her first brutal years at Southwestern, through every condescending comment from male coworkers who assumed she'd gotten hired to fill a diversity quota. When she'd wanted to quit, when the casual sexism and constant testing had felt overwhelming, she'd remembered her grandfather's words. "You've got the gift." Those memories had pulled her here, even when logic screamed to walk away. She'd negotiated with the bank for 60 days to assess the business. 60 days to sort through decades of accumulated inventory, to evaluate the equipment, to determine if there was any viable path forward. 60 days to decide if Torres Auto Repair would die with Miguel Torres or find new life under new management. The bank officer, a woman in her 40s named Patricia Sandoval, had been surprisingly sympathetic. 60 days, she'd agreed, sliding the paperwork across her desk. "But I need to be honest with you, Ms. Torres. The numbers are bad. Really bad. Unless you can demonstrate a clear path to profitability, the bank will have no choice but to foreclose. I knew your grandfather. He was a good man. But sentiment doesn't pay mortgages." Rachel had signed the papers, knowing she was probably making a mistake, unable to stop herself anyway. Now, standing in the Arizona heat with sweat already dampening her shirt, she took a deep breath and stepped into the garage. The main workshop was exactly as her grandfather had left it. A 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback, cherry red with a white racing stripe, sat on jack stands, its transmission partially disassembled on a workbench. Tools hung on pegboards with faded painted outlines showing where each belonged, a organizational system her grandfather had maintained religiously. A calendar from 6 months ago still hung on the wall beside the parts counter, marked with appointments Miguel Torres would never keep. Coffee mugs, some still containing the dried remnants of his last cups, sat on various surfaces. Reading glasses perched on the edge of the desk. A well-worn copy of a transmission rebuild manual lay open to page 147. It was like walking into a time capsule, a moment frozen in place. Rachel's throat tightened. She'd expected this to be difficult, but the reality of her grandfather's absence hit harder than anticipated. Every object, every tool, every grease stain on the concrete floor held a memory. She forced herself to focus. 60 days. That's all she had. She spent the first day simply walking through the space, taking inventory, making notes. The hydraulic lift in Bay 1 was functional but needed inspection and certification. The air compressor wheezed and rattled. The parts inventory was chaos, decades of accumulated components stored with a logic that had made sense only to Miguel. The office above the workshop was buried under paperwork, filing cabinets stuffed to bursting. The lawyer had mentioned that her grandfather kept meticulous records. "Everything's documented," he'd said. Financial statements going back 40 years, customer histories, parts inventories, service records. Your grandfather was old school organized, kept everything on paper. You'll find it all in the office. Rachel had expected filing cabinets full of paper invoices and handwritten ledgers. What she hadn't expected was the obsessive level of detail. Miguel hadn't just recorded transactions, he'd documented everything. Customer conversations, technical problems and their solutions, notes about weather conditions on particular repair days, even philosophical observations about the nature of mechanical work. It was as if he'd been creating a historical record, preserving something he knew was disappearing. As the afternoon wore on, Rachel found herself noticing something that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't know the shop as intimately as she did. The floor layout was wrong. She stood in the center of the main workshop, slowly turning in a circle, trying to identify what was bothering her. The space felt smaller than it should be. The back wall seemed closer than her childhood memories suggested. Rachel had played in this shop for years as a child, had memorized every corner, every shadow, every place where the concrete floor had cracked or stained. She knew this building's dimensions instinctively, the way you know the layout of your childhood home. Something was off. She found a 50-foot tape measure in one of the toolboxes and began measuring. Starting from the front entrance, she measured the depth of the building, 42 feet from the front door to the exterior back wall. Then she measured the interior space, only 36 feet from the front entrance to the interior back wall. 6 feet of space that didn't exist on the inside of the building. Rachel stood staring at the back wall, her mind racing. The wall was covered in heavy-duty metal shelving units, industrial strength, bolted into the concrete floor and wall. The shelves were loaded with decades of automotive parts, old carburetors, starters, alternators, brake drums, transmissions in various states of disassembly. Hundreds of pounds of metal and components. She pressed her hands against one of the shelving units and pushed. Despite its weight, she felt the slightest give, a subtle movement that suggested the shelf wasn't actually attached to a solid wall behind it. There was hollow space back there. Rachel spent the next 3 hours unbolting and methodically moving the heavy shelving units. It was brutal work in the Arizona heat, even with the shop's industrial fans running. Sweat soaked through her shirt. Her muscles screamed. But she couldn't stop, driven by a curiosity that had become almost obsessive. As the last major shelf unit was moved aside, Rachel found what she'd been looking for. Behind the shelves, covered in decades of grime and dust, was a steel door. Not a modern door, but something that looked military in origin. Heavy-gauge steel, reinforced edges, no handle on the outside, just a recessed lock mechanism that looked like it required a specific key. The door was painted the same industrial gray as the walls, deliberately camouflaged. Unless you were looking for it, unless you had reason to move the shelving units, you'd never know it existed. Rachel ran her fingers along the door's edges, feeling the precision of its construction. This wasn't something her grandfather had installed himself. This was professional work, designed to last, designed to be secure. Designed to hide something. Her hands were shaking. In all her childhood visits, in all the countless hours she'd spent in this shop, in all the times she'd helped her grandfather, explored every corner, investigated every cabinet and drawer with a child's natural curiosity, she'd never seen this door. Never even suspected it existed. The question was, had her grandfather deliberately hidden it from everyone, or had he simply never mentioned it because he assumed it wasn't important? Rachel had a feeling it was the former. She spent the remainder of the afternoon and into the evening searching through her grandfather's office, a cluttered room above the main workshop accessible by a narrow staircase. The space was a monument to organized chaos. Filing cabinets lined every wall, the desk was buried under layers of paperwork, and boxes of documents were stacked precariously in corners. She went through everything systematically. Customer files dating back to the 1970s. Financial records documenting every dollar earned and spent. Parts catalogs from defunct manufacturers. Photographs showing the shop in various stages of its history. Letters from satisfied customers. Commendations from the local Chamber of Commerce. Her grandfather's honorable discharge papers from the Army. His Korean War service medals in a velvet-lined box. But no key that would fit that door. It was nearly midnight when Rachel finally found it. She'd been about to give up for the night when she noticed that one of the filing cabinets didn't sit flush against the wall. There was a gap of perhaps an inch, just enough to suggest something was behind it. Moving the heavy cabinet required every bit of strength she had left, but eventually she managed to shift it enough to access the wall behind. There, screwed into the wall at shoulder height, was a small metal box, painted the same color as the wall, almost invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Inside the box was a single key. Military issue by the looks of it, stamped with serial numbers and a date, 1953. The year her grandfather had returned from the Korean War. Rachel held the key in her palm, feeling its weight, studying the worn metal. This key had been used, many times, over many years. Her grandfather had accessed whatever was behind that door regularly. Why had he never told anyone about it? She descended back to the workshop, key in hand, her exhaustion forgotten in a surge of adrenaline. The shop was dark except for the single overhead light she'd left on. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound. Rachel approached the hidden door, took a deep breath, and slid the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, well maintained despite its age. The mechanism disengaged with a solid click, and the heavy steel door swung inward with a pneumatic hiss that suggested the space beyond was sealed, climate-controlled. Rachel felt along the interior wall and found a light switch. Fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, revealing a narrow room approximately 6 feet deep and 12 feet wide, running along the back of the workshop. The space was climate-controlled, she realized with growing shock. A commercial-grade dehumidifier sat in one corner, its LED display showing 45% humidity. An air filtration unit hummed softly. The temperature was significantly cooler than the workshop, probably around 65 degrees. Her grandfather had been running this equipment for decades, maintaining precise environmental conditions, protecting whatever was stored here. The electrical bill alone must have been substantial. Metal shelving lined both long walls from floor to ceiling, and every shelf was filled with carefully organized materials. Cardboard document boxes, labeled and dated. Plastic bins containing photographs. Binders full of page-protected papers. Filing boxes containing what appeared to be letters and correspondence. In the center of the room sat a military-issue footlocker, olive drab with stenciled white letters, SGTM, Torres, 40th INFDIV. Rachel approached the footlocker slowly, almost reverently. She'd never seen this before. Had never known her grandfather had kept his military gear. The footlocker wasn't locked. She lifted the heavy lid, and the smell of old leather and preserved paper wafted up. Inside, carefully preserved and organized with the same meticulous attention her grandfather had applied to everything in his life, was a leather-bound diary. It was thick, hundreds of pages, the leather worn smooth from handling. Alongside it were photographs in protective sleeves, military documents in waterproof pouches, newspaper clippings preserved in plastic, and what appeared to be official correspondence on Department of Defense letterhead. Rachel lifted the diary with trembling hands. The leather was soft, well cared for, frequently touched. This wasn't something her grandfather had packed away and forgotten. This was something he'd returned to, again and again, over the decades. She opened it to the first page. The date written at the top in her grandfather's precise handwriting, July 15, 1953. Beneath it, an inscription, "If you're reading this, I'm gone." What follows is the truth. Do with it what you will, but know that I tried. God forgive me, I tried. Rachel's heart pounded as she turned to the next page and began reading her grandfather's words from 70 years ago. They told us we were heroes when we came home. They pinned medals on our chests in ceremonies with flags and brass bands. They sent us home with handshakes and parades, with speeches about honor and duty and the American way. The newspapers called us the greatest generation. Politicians used our service in their campaigns. We were symbols of something larger than ourselves. But what they did to those men, to those prisoners we were supposed to protect according to the Geneva Conventions, was not heroic. It was murder. Cold, calculated, systematic murder. And when it was over, when the bodies had been buried in unmarked graves and the evidence burned, command covered it up. They falsified reports, destroyed documents, transferred witnesses to different units, and threatened courts-martial for anyone who spoke about what we'd seen. I was there. I saw it happen. I have the photographs to prove it, though God knows I wish I didn't. I have the documents they thought they'd destroyed. I have the testimony of men who were there, who saw what I saw, who carry the same burden of knowledge. And I have kept silent for fear of what speaking would cost. Not just me, but my family, my future, everyone I love. But silence has its own cost, and I've paid it every day for the last 7 decades. Rachel's hands shook so badly she had to set the diary down for a moment. She looked around the hidden room, seeing it now for what it truly was, not just storage, but an archive. A carefully maintained collection of evidence. Her grandfather hadn't just witnessed something terrible. He documented it, preserved it, kept it safe for decades, waiting for, what? The right moment? The right person? The courage he'd never quite found. She picked up the diary again and continued reading. The entries were detailed, written with the same precision her grandfather had applied to rebuild specifications and technical procedures. He documented dates, times, locations, names of officers and enlisted men. He described events with brutal clarity, holding nothing back, creating a record that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. And as Rachel read deeper into the diary, a name began appearing with increasing frequency. An officer. A lieutenant at the time, later promoted through the ranks with extraordinary speed. Lieutenant James Edward Harrington. Rachel's breath caught. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. General James Edward Harrington. 4-star general. Recipient of 3 Distinguished Service Crosses. Presidential Medal of Freedom. The man who'd served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from 1985 to 1989. The man whose autobiography, Duty and Honor, had been a bestseller and was required reading at West Point. The man whose name graced military bases, whose bronze statue stood at the entrance to the National War Museum, who died just 3 years ago as one of the most respected military leaders in American history. According to her grandfather's diary, James Harrington had been the officer who ordered the executions. Who'd personally shot at least 3 prisoners. Who'd then systematically destroyed evidence, threatened witnesses, and built his career on a foundation of covered-up war crimes. Rachel sat back against the cool concrete wall of the hidden room, the diary open in her lap, her mind reeling. The struggling auto shop she'd inherited suddenly seemed like the least significant thing Miguel Torres had left behind. He'd left her the truth. A truth that powerful people, powerful institutions, had spent half a century keeping buried. A truth that, if it came to light, would demolish the reputation of one of America's most celebrated military heroes. A truth that could expose systemic corruption at the highest levels of military command. And now she had to decide what to do with it. Rachel looked around the room again, seeing now the full scope of what her grandfather had created. This wasn't just a diary and some documents. This was a comprehensive archive, hundreds of photographs, official military records, letters between officers discussing the incident in coded language, newspaper clippings about Harrington's subsequent career, even what appeared to be audio recordings on old cassette tapes. Her grandfather had spent decades collecting evidence, documenting everything, building an irrefutable case. But he'd never released it. Never gone public. Never sought justice for what he'd witnessed. Why? Rachel found part of the answer in a letter dated 1987, tucked into the diary. It was from another veteran, someone who'd been there that day in Korea. The letter was brief. "Miguel, I know you still have the evidence. I know you think about releasing it. I'm writing to beg you not to. Harrington's people came to see me last month. They knew I'd been asking questions. They made it very clear what would happen if I continued. They know about my grandchildren, Miguel. They know where they go to school. I can't risk it. I'm sorry. I know we promised those men we'd tell their story someday. But I can't be the one to do it. I hope you can forgive me." Rachel felt cold despite the climate-controlled room's comfortable temperature. Her grandfather had been afraid. Not for himself, but for his family. For his children and grandchildren. He'd kept silent to protect them. But he'd also kept everything, preserved it all, organized it meticulously, as if he'd been preparing for a day when someone would be ready to tell the story he couldn't tell himself. Rachel looked at her phone. It was nearly 2 a.m. She'd been in this room for almost 3 hours, reading, absorbing, trying to process the magnitude of what she'd discovered. She thought about her mother's advice: sell everything and walk away. Cut your losses. She thought about her brother's dismissal: don't throw away your career on a dead business. She thought about the bank officer's warning: sentiment doesn't pay mortgages. They were all right, in their way. The smart move, the safe move, the logical move was to liquidate the shop, forget about this hidden room and its contents, let the past stay buried where powerful people wanted it to stay. But Rachel thought about something else too. She thought about her grandfather's words: "You've got the gift. Don't let anyone tell you different." She thought about the countless times she'd faced dismissal and skepticism in her career, times when the easy path would have been to give up, to accept that maybe she didn't belong in a field dominated by men who didn't want her there. She thought about the prisoners whose deaths had been covered up, whose families had been told they'd died in combat, who'd been denied truth and justice for 70 years. And she thought about the legacy her grandfather had left her. Not the struggling auto shop with its mounting debts and outdated equipment. But this, evidence of truth, carefully preserved, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light. Rachel carefully closed the diary and placed it back in the footlocker. She stood, switched off the lights, and locked the steel door behind her. She didn't replace the shelving units. There was no point in hiding it anymore. Tomorrow, she would begin reading through everything. She would understand the full scope of what her grandfather had documented. And then she would decide what to do with it. But one thing was already clear: her 60 days trying to save Torres Auto Repair had just become about something much larger than a failing business. Her grandfather had protected this secret for decades, waiting for the right moment, the right person. Maybe he'd been waiting for her all along. For someone who understood what it meant to fight against a system that didn't want you there. For someone who knew the cost of speaking truth when silence would be easier. For someone who had the gift. As Rachel locked up the shop and drove home through the empty Arizona night, she had no idea how her decision would transform not just her life, but reshape the historical record, expose corruption at the highest levels of power, and force a reckoning with America's military legacy. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she wasn't selling the shop. Not yet. Preparing and narrating this story has taken us considerable time and effort. If you're finding value in Rachel's journey, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. It truly means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you these powerful stories. Now, back to Rachel's discovery. The next morning arrived too quickly. Rachel had managed maybe 3 hours of fitful sleep, her mind churning through everything she'd read in her grandfather's diary. She'd dreamed of faceless soldiers, of her grandfather as a young man, of secrets wrapped in shadows. She arrived at Torres Auto Repair just after dawn, the Arizona sky painted in shades of orange and pink. The shop looked different now, transformed by knowledge. It wasn't just her grandfather's failing business anymore. It was the repository of a truth that had been buried for 7 decades. Rachel made coffee in the small break room, using her grandfather's ancient percolator that gurgled and hissed like it was on its last legs. The familiar ritual helped center her thoughts. She had 60 days to make a decision about the shop. But now she also had to decide what to do with the archive hidden in that climate-controlled room. The smart move would be to separate the two issues. Deal with the business first, the evidence second. But Rachel knew instinctively that they were connected in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her grandfather hadn't just witnessed a single incident. He'd documented a pattern of behavior spanning nearly 3 years of the Korean War. Lieutenant James Harrington, according to the records, had commanded a prisoner interrogation unit attached to the 40th Infantry Division. The unit's official purpose was intelligence gathering from North Korean and Chinese prisoners of war. Its unofficial purpose, according to Miguel's meticulous documentation, was something far darker. The diary entries from 1951 described interrogation techniques that violated every provision of the Geneva Conventions. Prisoners denied medical care. Extended periods of isolation. Sleep deprivation. Beatings that left men permanently injured. And in at least 17 documented cases, executions of prisoners who were deemed uncooperative or dangerous. But what made the evidence particularly damning was that Miguel hadn't just recorded his own observations. He'd collected official documents that proved command knew what was happening and had actively concealed it. Rachel found carbon copies of reports that had been altered before being sent up the chain of command. Original versions described prisoner deaths honestly, the official versions attributed them to combat injuries or natural causes. She found transfer orders moving witnesses to different units immediately after incidents. She found confidential memos discussing the need to manage the narrative around the interrogation unit's activities. And she found photographs. Her grandfather had somehow obtained a camera, probably through the black market that existed in every war zone. The photographs were grainy, taken in poor light, but they were clear enough. Images of prisoners in conditions that shocked even Rachel's hardened sensibilities. Men with visible injuries. Emaciated bodies. And in one particularly devastating series of photos, what appeared to be a mass burial site. Rachel had to stop several times, overwhelmed by the brutality documented in these images. These weren't enemy combatants killed in battle. These were prisoners of war, protected under international law, systematically abused and murdered. And Lieutenant James Harrington appeared in numerous photographs, easily identifiable even in his youth. In some images, he was overseeing interrogations. In others, he stood among the prisoners, his expression cold and calculating. And in one photograph that Rachel stared at for a long time, he stood with his sidearm drawn, aimed at a kneeling prisoner whose hands were bound behind his back. The photograph was dated March 17, 1953. According to her grandfather's diary entry for that day, Harrington had personally executed 3 prisoners that afternoon, claiming they had attempted to escape. Miguel's account made it clear there had been no escape attempt. The prisoners had been executed for refusing to provide intelligence they didn't possess. They died for nothing, Miguel had written. 3 young men, barely 20 years old, shot in the back of the head and buried in an unmarked grave. And Harrington filed a report describing a heroic prevention of an escape attempt. He was commended for his decisive action. He received a Bronze Star. Rachel set down the diary and pressed her hands against her eyes. The scope of the cover-up was staggering. This wasn't just one rogue officer committing war crimes. This was systemic. Command had known, had concealed, had rewarded the very behavior that violated every principle the military claimed to uphold. And James Harrington had built a legendary career on that foundation. Rachel continued reading, moving chronologically through the archive. What emerged was the story of how Harrington had leveraged his wartime success into rapid promotion. The interrogation unit's methods, brutal as they were, had produced intelligence that command valued. Or at least, Harrington had been skilled at presenting his results in ways that pleased his superiors. By 1955, he was a captain. By 1960, a major. The promotions continued, each accompanied by commendations that praised his innovative approaches to intelligence gathering and his decisive leadership under pressure. Miguel's diary entries during these years showed a man struggling with impossible choices. He'd returned from Korea, married Rachel's grandmother Elena, started the auto repair shop. He'd tried to build a normal life. But the weight of what he'd witnessed, what he'd documented, never left him. In 1956, he'd written, "I saw Harrington on television today. They're calling him a rising star in military intelligence. They talk about his innovations, his brilliant tactical mind. Nobody mentions the prisoners. Nobody talks about the graves." I wanted to throw something at the television, to scream the truth at his smug face. But what good would it do? Who would believe a mechanic over a decorated war hero? Miguel had tried to go public once, in 1962. Rachel found the correspondence, letters to his congressman, to military oversight committees, even to journalists. The responses were either dismissive or openly hostile. One letter from a military affairs reporter was particularly cutting. "Mr. Torres, accusations of this nature require extraordinary evidence. What you're describing would constitute serious war crimes by one of our most respected officers. Without corroborating witnesses, official documentation, or physical evidence beyond your personal testimony, I cannot in good conscience pursue this story. I suggest you consider whether your memories of traumatic events may have become distorted over time." Miguel had the evidence, of course. But showing it meant putting himself and his family at risk. And by 1962, Harrington was already too powerful, too connected. Miguel had received a visit from two men in civilian clothes shortly after his letters began circulating. They'd been polite but clear, continuing to make accusations would have consequences. "They knew about Elena," Miguel had written. "They knew about my children, about where Carmen went to school, about Daniel's baseball games. They didn't make explicit threats. They didn't need to. The message was clear: drop this, or your family pays the price." So Miguel had stopped. He'd continued running his shop, raising his family, maintaining his silence. But he'd also continued collecting evidence, adding to the archive, documenting Harrington's rise through the ranks, creating a comprehensive record of both the original crimes and the subsequent cover-up. Rachel found newspaper clippings spanning decades. Articles praising Harrington's service in Vietnam, his innovative counterinsurgency strategies, his leadership at various commands. By the 1980s, he was one of the most powerful men in the military, serving as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, advising presidents, shaping military policy. And through it all, Miguel Torres had maintained his archive, a one-man keeper of secrets that could have destroyed Harrington at any point. But he'd never used it, never exposed the truth, held back by fear for his family and the pragmatic recognition that one man couldn't fight an entire system. Rachel found entries from the 1990s and 2000s showing her grandfather's increasing frustration. Harrington had retired in 1991, received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, published his best-selling memoir. He'd become an elder statesman, a respected voice on military affairs, a symbol of American military excellence. "He's everywhere," Miguel wrote in 1995. Cable news, congressional testimony, book tours. They treat him like he's George Washington reborn. They ask his opinion on Kosovo, on Somalia, on military readiness. And I sit in my shop, hands covered in grease, knowing the truth about what kind of man he really is. The weight of this silence is crushing me. But then Rachel found something that changed her understanding of everything. A document box labeled Other Witnesses, Contact Attempts 1985 to 2015. Inside were letters, emails, and handwritten notes documenting Miguel's attempts to locate and contact other members of the interrogation unit. Men who had served alongside him, who had witnessed the same atrocities, who might be willing to corroborate his account. What Rachel discovered was heartbreaking. Of the 23 men Miguel had served within that unit, he'd been able to locate 17. Of those 17, 9 had died by the time he reached out to them. Of the remaining 8, 6 had refused to discuss Korea at all, responding to Miguel's inquiries with terse letters stating they had nothing to say. That left 2 men, Thomas Brennan and Robert Chen. Brennan had corresponded with Miguel for years. His letters, preserved in plastic sleeves, told a story of another man haunted by what he'd witnessed. Brennan had been a medic, forced to stand by while prisoners were denied treatment, made to falsify medical records to support the cover-up. "I've tried to forget," Brennan wrote in 1988. "I've tried to convince myself it was war, that we did what we had to do, that the ends justified the means. But I can't. I see their faces. I hear their screams. And I know that what we did wasn't war. It was murder, plain and simple. But Miguel, I'm scared. I'm scared of what speaking out would cost. I have grandchildren now. I have a life. And I'm too much of a coward to risk it." The letters continued through the years, Brennan and Miguel supporting each other through the shared burden of knowledge, but neither finding the courage to speak publicly. The final letter from Brennan was dated 2009. "Miguel, they came to my house. 2 men in suits. They didn't identify themselves, didn't need to. They knew about my correspondence with you. They knew I'd been asking questions, reaching out to other veterans. They made it very clear that if I continued, there would be consequences. They mentioned my daughter, my grandchildren by name. I'm done, my friend. I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry." There were no more letters from Thomas Brennan after that. A obituary clipping from 2011 indicated he'd died of a heart attack at age 78. Robert Chen's story was different. He'd been an intelligence analyst assigned to the unit, responsible for processing and reporting the information extracted from prisoners. Unlike Brennan, Chen had been willing to speak publicly. He'd given an interview to a small alternative newspaper in 2003, describing war crimes he'd witnessed in Korea. The article had been published, but it had gone nowhere. The mainstream media hadn't picked it up. Chen had been dismissed as a disgruntled veteran with an axe to grind. And within a week of the article's publication, Chen had recanted his statements in a written apology, claiming he'd been confused, that his memories were unreliable, that he'd spoken in error. Miguel had included a letter from Chen explaining what had happened. "They threatened my family, Miguel. Not subtly, not with implications. They showed me photographs of my grandson leaving school. They knew his schedule, his route home, everything. They said accidents happen to children all the time. What was I supposed to do? I told the truth, and they destroyed me for it. I had to recant. I had to protect my family. God forgive me, but I chose my family over justice for those dead prisoners." Rachel set down the letter, her hands shaking. This wasn't just about one officer's crimes or even one war's atrocities. This was about a system so invested in protecting its reputation that it would threaten children to maintain a lie. She continued through the archive, finding more evidence of the cover-up scope. Internal military documents obtained through Miguel's contacts showing that multiple investigations had been quietly shut down over the years. Congressional inquiries that had been redirected or stonewalled. Journalists who'd been threatened or discredited when they got too close to the truth. The Harrington family, Rachel discovered, had become increasingly powerful over the decades. James Harrington's son, Douglas, was now a senator from Virginia, serving on the Armed Services Committee. His grandson, James Harrington III, was a colonel currently deployed overseas. The family name carried weight in military and political circles. And they had protected that name ruthlessly. Rachel found documentation of at least 6 serious attempts to expose Harrington's war crimes over the past 50 years. All had been suppressed, deflected, or discredited. The pattern was consistent. Initial allegations would surface, usually from a veteran. There would be a brief flurry of interest, then the veteran would either recant, disappear from public view, or be discredited as unstable or unreliable. In 2 cases, the veterans making accusations had died under circumstances that Miguel's notes suggested were suspicious, though nothing was ever proven. "They've built an empire on lies," Miguel had written in a 2010 diary entry. "And they'll kill to protect it. I'm certain of that now. I've kept this evidence safe for 60 years, but what good has it done? The truth sits in this room, carefully preserved, meticulously documented, and completely useless because I'm too afraid to use it. What kind of man does that make me?" Rachel felt tears stinging her eyes as she read her grandfather's words. He'd carried this burden for 60 years, torn between the need for justice and the instinct to protect his family. He'd never forgiven himself for his silence, even though his silence had probably saved his family from the fate that had befallen others who'd tried to speak out. She stood, stretching muscles that had grown stiff from hours of reading, and walked to the workshop's high windows. Outside, Copper Ridge continued its ordinary existence. Cars passed on the highway. The strip mall across the street saw its usual trickle of customers. Life went on, oblivious to the explosive truth hidden in this failing auto shop. Rachel pulled out her phone and began researching. She spent the next 2 hours learning everything she could about current investigative journalism practices, about how to approach media outlets with sensitive stories, about whistleblower protections and legal considerations. She also researched the Harrington family. Senator Douglas Harrington was indeed powerful, currently positioning himself for a presidential run in 2 years. Colonel James Harrington III was following in his grandfather's footsteps, building a reputation as an innovative military thinker. The family controlled significant wealth, had connections throughout government and military circles, and had a history of aggressively protecting their reputation. Taking them on would be like declaring war on one of the most powerful families in American political life. Rachel's phone rang, jarring her from her research. It was her mother. "Rachel, I've been thinking," Carmen said without preamble. "I know you wanted 60 days to evaluate the shop, but I've been talking to a commercial real estate agent. There's a developer interested in that entire strip. They're offering above market value if we can close quickly. We could pay off all the debts and have money left over. You could go back to your job, put this whole mess behind you." "Mom, I can't talk about this right now." "Rachel, please. I know you have sentimental feelings about the shop, but Dad wouldn't want you to sacrifice your future for it. He was practical about business. He'd understand." Rachel almost laughed at the irony. Her mother had no idea what their practical, business-minded father had really been doing all those years in his shop. That he'd been maintaining something far more important than an auto repair business. "I'll think about it, Mom. I need to go." After hanging up, Rachel returned to the archive. She pulled down another box, this one labeled Supporting Evidence Independent Verification. Inside, she found something that changed everything: copies of Soviet and Chinese military records. Her grandfather had somehow obtained declassified documents from archives in Russia and China, records that independently corroborated his account. The communist forces had documented American war crimes for propaganda purposes, and their records matched Miguel's diary almost exactly. Dates, locations, prisoner names, circumstances of deaths, it all aligned. This was the smoking gun. Evidence from hostile nations that nonetheless confirmed every detail of Miguel's accusations. Evidence that couldn't be dismissed as the confused memories of a traumatized veteran. Rachel also found something else in that box, a thumb drive, dated just 6 months before her grandfather's death. She carried it to the office computer, an ancient desktop that wheezed to life after several attempts. The drive contained video files. Rachel clicked on the first one, and her grandfather's face appeared on screen. He looked older than she remembered, his illness already visible in the hollows of his cheeks and the way his hands trembled slightly. "Rachel," his recorded voice said, and she had to pause the video, overwhelmed by hearing him again. She took a breath and resumed playback. "If you're watching this, then you've found the archive. That means I'm gone, and you've taken over the shop, and you're curious enough or stubborn enough to have discovered what I've kept hidden all these years. Those are good qualities. You'll need them for what comes next. I've spent 60 years collecting this evidence. 60 years carrying the weight of silence. 60 years protecting my family from the consequences of truth. Your grandmother knew some of it, but not all. I never told your mother or your Uncle Daniel. The burden was mine alone. But I couldn't bring myself to destroy it either. These men, these prisoners who were murdered, they deserve to have their stories told. Their families deserve the truth. And General Harrington deserved to be held accountable for what he did. I was too afraid to be the one to do it. I've made my peace with that. But I've also prepared this archive for someone braver than me. Someone who might look at this evidence and decide that justice delayed is better than justice denied forever. If that's you, Mija, if you decide to take this public, I want you to know what you're facing. The Harrington family has spent 70 years building their reputation. They have power, money, connections at every level of government and military. They will come after you with everything they have. They will try to discredit you, intimidate you, maybe worse. But you also have something they can't fight, the truth, documented beyond any reasonable doubt. You have photographs they can't explain away. You have documents in their own handwriting. You have independent corroboration from multiple sources. If you can get this evidence to the right people, journalists with integrity, prosecutors with courage, they won't be able to suppress it this time. I'm not telling you what to do. This is your choice, not mine. If you decide to keep it hidden, to let the past stay buried, I'll understand. God knows I did the same for 60 years. But if you decide to fight, know that your grandfather is proud of you. And know that those men who died in unmarked graves, whose families still don't know what happened to them, they're counting on someone to finally tell their story. You've always had the gift, Mija. The ability to see what others miss, to understand what machines and systems are trying to tell you. This isn't about engines or transmissions, but it's the same skill. This system has been broken for 70 years, hiding its dysfunction behind a polished exterior. You can fix it if you choose to. Whatever you decide, I love you. I'm proud of who you've become. And I'm sorry for leaving you with this burden. But I couldn't think of anyone else I'd trust with it. The video ended. Rachel sat staring at the blank screen, tears streaming down her face. Her grandfather had known. He'd known she would find the archive. He'd prepared it specifically for her, organized it for maximum impact, created a roadmap for how to use it effectively. He'd even anticipated her doubts and fears, addressing them in advance. He'd been training her for this her entire life, she realized. Every lesson about integrity, every conversation about doing the right thing even when it was hard, every time he'd told her she had the gift, he'd been preparing her to be the person who could finally tell the truth he'd been too afraid to tell himself. Rachel wiped her eyes and pulled out her phone. She had research to do, decisions to make, strategies to plan. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she had and how to use it most effectively. She spent the rest of the day creating a comprehensive inventory of the archive. She photographed every document, digitized every photograph, backed everything up to multiple secure cloud storage locations. She organized the evidence chronologically, created a detailed index, prepared a summary document outlining the key points of the case. By the time the sun set over Copper Ridge, Rachel had transformed her grandfather's archive into a prosecution-ready case file. She had the evidence. She had corroboration. She had a clear chain of custody for physical evidence. She had contemporary documents that couldn't be dismissed as faulty memory. What she needed now was the right platform to release it. And the courage to face the consequences. As she locked up the shop that evening, Rachel made a decision. She wouldn't sell Torres Auto Repair. Not yet. The shop was more than her grandfather's failing business. It was his legacy, his statement, his act of resistance. Keeping it meant honoring everything he'd stood for, even if he'd never found the courage to act on those principles. But she would do what he couldn't. She would tell the truth. She would bring the evidence into the light. She would fight for justice for those prisoners who'd been denied it for 70 years. And if the Harrington family wanted to come after her for it, let them come. She was her grandfather's granddaughter, and she had the gift. The gift of seeing broken systems and knowing how to fix them. The following morning, Rachel arrived at the shop to find something that immediately set her nerves on edge. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel parking lot, too fresh to have been there when she'd locked up the night before. They circled the building, as if someone had been surveying the property from their vehicle. She checked the locks on the main entrance. Undisturbed. The windows showed no signs of tampering. But the surveillance feeling persisted, a prickling awareness that she wasn't as alone in this as she'd thought. Rachel entered the shop cautiously, checking every corner, every shadow. Nothing appeared disturbed. The hidden room remained locked, the archive untouched. But she couldn't shake the sensation that something had changed, that her actions yesterday had somehow been noticed. She was being paranoid, she told herself. Nobody knew what she'd found. Nobody was watching her. But her grandfather's warnings echoed in her mind, they will come after you with everything they have. Rachel pushed the unease aside and focused on her next step. She needed to find the right journalist, someone with the credibility and courage to handle a story this explosive. Someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. Someone who understood military affairs and had a track record of holding powerful institutions accountable. She spent 2 hours researching investigative journalists who specialized in military and government accountability. She compiled a list of 15 names, then began the painstaking process of vetting each one. Who had they worked for? What stories had they broken? Had they faced retaliation? How had they protected their sources? 3 names emerged as possibilities: Marcus Webb, a Pulitzer Prize winner who'd exposed Abu Ghraib abuses; Jennifer Castellanos, who'd written a best-selling exposé on military contractor fraud; and David Kim, whose documentary on Vietnam War atrocities had won an Academy Award. Any of them would have the platform and credibility to bring her grandfather's evidence to national attention. But which one could she trust with something this sensitive? Rachel was so absorbed in her research that she almost missed the car pulling into the parking lot. A silver sedan, generic and unremarkable, driven by a woman who looked to be in her 50s. She wore business casual clothing and carried a leather portfolio. The woman entered the shop, her movements confident and purposeful. "Rachel Torres?" she asked, her voice pleasant but professional. Rachel's guard went up immediately. "Who's asking?" "My name is Dr. Sarah Lindstrom. I'm a historian with the Veterans Legacy Foundation. We're conducting research on Korean War veterans from this region, and your grandfather's name came up in our database. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about his service." Everything about the woman seemed legitimate. Professional demeanor, proper identification when Rachel asked for it, a plausible reason for being there. But the timing felt too coincidental. "I'm sorry," Rachel said carefully. "This isn't a good time. Maybe you could leave your contact information and I'll reach out later." Dr. Lindstrom smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course. Though I should mention, we're particularly interested in veterans who served in intelligence units. Your grandfather was attached to a prisoner interrogation unit in 1952 and 1953, is that correct?" Rachel's blood ran cold. That information wasn't in any public database. The unit's activities had been classified, and according to her grandfather's records, most documentation had been destroyed or sealed. "I really don't know anything about my grandfather's specific service record," Rachel said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "He didn't talk about the war much. That's understandable. Many veterans prefer not to discuss traumatic experiences." Dr. Lindstrom's eyes traveled around the shop, taking in details with an intensity that belied her casual tone. "This is quite a place. Your grandfather maintained it for almost 50 years, didn't he? That's dedication. I imagine he accumulated quite a bit of historical material over the decades." The implication was clear. This woman knew, or at least suspected, that Miguel had kept records. This wasn't a random academic inquiry. If you'll excuse me, Rachel said firmly, moving toward the door in a clear dismissal. I have work to do. Like I said, you can leave your information. Dr. Lindstrom didn't move. Ms. Torres, I think you should know that there are people who are very interested in any materials your grandfather might have kept from his military service. These materials could be historically significant. They might also be sensitive. The kind of thing that should be handled through proper channels. Proper channels meaning what, exactly? Meaning that if such materials exist, they should be turned over to the appropriate military archives for proper classification review. Some information related to wartime operations remains classified for national security reasons. Unauthorized possession or disclosure could have serious legal implications. There it was. Not even thinly veiled. This was a threat dressed up as friendly advice. I appreciate your concern, Rachel said, her voice ice-cold now. But as I said, I don't know what you're talking about. Now, I need you to leave my property. Dr. Lindstrom studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Of course. But Ms. Torres? If you do happen to come across any military documents or materials, I strongly encourage you to contact me before taking any irreversible actions. For your own protection. She placed a business card on the counter and left. Rachel watched through the window as the silver sedan pulled away, memorizing the license plate number. Her hands were shaking. Less than 24 hours after deciding to expose the truth, they'd already found her. Or at least, they'd found enough to know she was worth investigating. Rachel immediately went to the hidden room and checked everything. Nothing appeared disturbed, but she spent the next hour installing additional security measures, a hidden camera pointed at the steel door, motion sensors, a secondary lock that only she would have the key to. She also began accelerating her timeline. She'd planned to take weeks carefully vetting journalists and building her case. But if the Harrington family's people were already sniffing around, she might not have weeks. She needed to move faster. Rachel pulled out her phone and called the first number on her journalist list. Marcus Webb's office connected her to his assistant. I need to speak with Mr. Webb about a story. It concerns documented war crimes from the Korean War that were systematically covered up by U.S. military command. The assistant's tone shifted from polite dismissal to sharp interest. Can you hold, please? 2 minutes later, a man's voice came on the line. This is Marcus Webb. My assistant says you have information about Korean War crimes? Rachel took a breath. This was the moment. Once she said this out loud to a journalist, there was no taking it back. My grandfather served in the 40th Infantry Division from 1951 to 1953. He was attached to a prisoner interrogation unit commanded by Lieutenant James Harrington. Over the course of nearly 3 years, he documented systematic torture and murder of prisoners of war, along with a subsequent cover-up that extended to the highest levels of military command. Silence on the other end. Then, James Harrington. As in General James Harrington? Chairman of the Joint Chiefs? Yes. Miss Torres. Rachel Torres. Ms. Torres, those are extraordinary claims. General Harrington is an American icon. What kind of documentation are we talking about? Contemporary diary entries written during the events. Photographs taken at the time. Original military documents showing systematic falsification of reports. Independent corroboration from Soviet and Chinese archives. Testimony from other witnesses who were threatened into silence. And a comprehensive paper trail showing 70 years of cover-up. Another pause. Where are you located? Copper Ridge, Arizona. I can be there tomorrow morning. But Ms. Torres, I need to be clear about something. If you're wasting my time, if this turns out to be conspiracy theories or misremembered trauma, I won't be gentle in my assessment. And if this is some kind of setup, I'll expose that too. It's not. I have everything I'm claiming and more. Then I'll see you tomorrow at 9 a.m. Don't contact anyone else about this. Don't make copies. Don't post anything online. Just sit tight until I get there. After hanging up, Rachel felt both relieved and terrified. She'd done it. She'd taken the first real step toward exposing the truth. But she'd also just painted a target on her back that would only grow larger as word spread that she was talking to journalists. The rest of the day passed in tense anticipation. Rachel tried to work on actual auto repairs, but her mind kept wandering to the archive, to Dr. Lindstrom's thinly veiled threats, to the meeting tomorrow with Marcus Webb. Around 3 p.m., her phone rang. An unknown number. Hello? Rachel Torres? A man's voice, older, with a slight southern accent. Who is this? My name is William Brennan. I'm Thomas Brennan's son. The Thomas Brennan who corresponded with your grandfather for almost 30 years. Rachel's heart rate spiked. How did you get this number? My father kept meticulous records, just like your grandfather did. He passed away in 2011, but before he died, he made me promise something. He said if Miguel Torres ever went public with what they knew, or if anyone in the Torres family started asking questions, I should reach out. He said you might need help. Help with what? With staying alive long enough to tell the story. William's voice was grim. Ms. Torres, my father spent 40 years looking over his shoulder. He knew what the Harrington family was capable of. The threats, the intimidation, the accidents that weren't really accidents. He wanted to speak out, wanted to support your grandfather, but he was terrified. And he had good reason to be. Why are you calling me now? Because 2 days ago, I received a visit from a woman claiming to be a historian researching Korean War veterans. She asked very specific questions about my father's service, about whether he'd left any papers or documents, about whether he'd ever made any unusual claims about his experiences in Korea. I didn't tell her anything, but the visit scared the hell out of me. And then I remembered my father's instructions about contacting the Torres family if anything like this happened. Dr. Lindstrom. The same woman who'd visited Rachel. She was systematically tracking down anyone connected to the interrogation unit or to Miguel's investigation. What did your father want you to tell me? Rachel asked. That you're not alone. There are other families who know the truth, who have evidence, who've been waiting for someone brave enough to bring everything into the light. My father kept his own records, Ms. Torres. Not as comprehensive as your grandfather's, but detailed enough. Medical records he falsified under orders. Lists of prisoners who disappeared. Testimony he wrote out but never delivered. He wanted me to offer you those records if you ever decided to fight. Rachel felt tears stinging her eyes. Her grandfather hadn't been as alone as he'd thought. Other men had carried the same burden, maintained the same vigil, preserved the same truth. I'm meeting with an investigative journalist tomorrow, she said. Marcus Webb from the Washington Standard. I'm going to show him everything. Good. That's good. Webb's solid, he won't back down from pressure. But Ms. Torres, you need to understand something. The moment you go public, your life changes forever. The Harrington family will come after you with everything they have. They'll try to discredit you, to paint you as unstable or opportunistic. They'll dig into every aspect of your life looking for ammunition. And if character assassination doesn't work, they'll escalate to more direct methods. You're trying to scare me. I'm trying to prepare you. My father lived in fear for 40 years. He died with regrets, but he also died peacefully in his bed surrounded by family. Once you do this, that peaceful ending might not be available to you. You need to go into this with eyes open. I understand. I hope so. I'll email you scans of my father's documents tonight. Use them however you need to. And Ms. Torres? Thank you. For having the courage my father never found. After the call ended, Rachel sat in silence, processing everything. The web of surveillance and suppression was more extensive than she'd imagined. The Harrington family had been monitoring anyone connected to the interrogation unit for decades, ready to intimidate or silence anyone who showed signs of speaking out. But now, for the first time, the silence was breaking. William Brennan wasn't the only one. If Thomas Brennan had kept records, others probably had too. Men who'd witnessed the atrocities and never found the courage to speak, but who'd preserved evidence hoping someone eventually would. Rachel's phone dinged with an email notification. William Brennan, true to his word, had sent over 200 pages of scanned documents. Medical records showing prisoners with injuries inconsistent with combat. Lists of names and dates. A detailed account Thomas Brennan had written in 1995, describing everything he'd witnessed in Korea. The case was getting stronger. With multiple witnesses, independent documentation, and physical evidence from multiple sources, it would be nearly impossible for the Harrington family to dismiss or discredit the allegations. As evening approached, Rachel heard another vehicle pull into the parking lot. This time, she recognized it immediately, her brother Daniel's BMW. He entered the shop looking irritated and uncomfortable, his expensive suit incongruous in the grease-stained environment. "Rachel, what the hell is going on?" he demanded without preamble. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I got a call today from someone claiming to be writing a book about Korean War veterans. They wanted to interview me about Grandpa's service. They asked very specific questions about whether he'd left any personal papers, whether he'd ever made any unusual claims about his experiences. I told them I didn't know anything, but the whole conversation felt off." Another contact attempt. The surveillance net was tightening. "When did this call happen?" Rachel asked. "About 2 hours ago." "Rachel, what's going on? Did Grandpa have some kind of classified information or something? Because these people seemed very interested in finding out what he might have left behind." Rachel made a split-second decision. Her brother was already being contacted, already drawn into this situation. He deserved to know why. "Come with me. I need to show you something." She led Daniel to the hidden room, unlocked the steel door, and showed him the archive. His expression shifted from confusion to shock to disbelief as he took in the scope of what their grandfather had preserved. "Holy shit," he whispered. "How long has this been here?" "Probably since the 1970s. Grandpa documented war crimes committed by the officer who became General James Harrington. And then he spent 70 years collecting evidence of the cover-up." Daniel stared at the shelves of documents, the photographs, the carefully organized evidence. Why didn't he ever go public? Because he was afraid. The Harrington family threatened anyone who tried to speak out. Other witnesses were intimidated into silence or worse. Grandpa kept everything, but he never found the courage to use it. "And you're planning to?" Daniel's voice was sharp. "Rachel, this is insane. These people are powerful. If what you're saying is true, they've been covering this up for 70 years. You think they're just going to let you expose them?" "I think the truth matters more than my comfort or safety." Jesus Christ. Daniel ran his hands through his hair, a gesture he'd made since childhood when stressed. "You're going to get yourself killed. Or sued into oblivion. Or both. Maybe. But I can't just keep this hidden. Those prisoners deserve justice. Their families deserve the truth. What about our family? What about Mom? You think she deserves to have her daughter become a target for one of the most powerful families in America? What would Grandpa want me to do?" Daniel was silent for a long moment. "That's not fair. Grandpa spent 70 years hiding this. Maybe he had good reasons." "He did. But he also left me a video message saying he was leaving this choice to me. He prepared all this evidence specifically so that someone could eventually use it. He just couldn't be that person himself. And you think you can?" Daniel shook his head. "Rachel, you're a mechanic. You're not equipped to take on something like this. You don't have lawyers, security, resources. The moment you go public, they'll destroy you. Maybe. Or maybe the truth is strong enough to protect itself once it's out in the open." Daniel looked around the archive again, his expression troubled. "I can't support this. I'm sorry, but I have a family to think about, a career. If you do this and it blows back on all of us. I understand. You don't have to be involved. But I'm doing this regardless. Her brother studied her face, seeing the determination there. You're really going through with this? I am. Then at least let me help you protect yourself. I have a friend who's a lawyer, specializes in whistleblower cases. Let me set up a meeting. You're going to need legal protection, probably personal security too. If you're determined to commit professional suicide, at least do it with some safeguards in place. Rachel felt a surge of gratitude. Her brother might not support her decision, but he wasn't going to abandon her either. Thank you, Daniel. Don't thank me yet. I still think this is a terrible idea. But you're my sister. If you're going to do something reckless and potentially fatal, I'm not letting you do it alone. After Daniel left, promising to arrange meetings with lawyers and security consultants, Rachel returned to the archive. She spent the evening organizing everything for Marcus Webb's visit tomorrow, creating a presentation that would hit the key points quickly and powerfully. Around midnight, exhausted but too wired to sleep, she sat in her grandfather's office chair and looked around the space. This ordinary auto shop had housed extraordinary secrets for decades. Her grandfather had lived a double life, humble mechanic by day, keeper of dangerous truths by night. And now that burden had passed to her. Rachel thought about the prisoners whose names filled her grandfather's diary. Young men, many of them barely out of their teens, who'd been tortured and murdered far from home. Their families had been told they died honorably in combat, never knowing the truth about their final days. She thought about the other witnesses who'd been threatened into silence, who'd carried the weight of knowledge for decades, who'd died with their stories untold. She thought about the system that had protected a war criminal for 70 years, that had elevated him to the highest levels of military leadership, that had made him an American icon while his victims lay in unmarked graves. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she was doing the right thing. The consequences might be severe. The Harrington family might destroy her reputation, her career, maybe her life. But some truths were too important to stay buried. Her grandfather had understood that, even if he'd never found the courage to act on it. He'd preserved the evidence, maintained the archive, prepared everything so that someone eventually could tell the story. That someone was her. Rachel locked up the shop and drove home through the dark Arizona night, aware that this might be one of the last peaceful evenings she'd have for a long time. Tomorrow, Marcus Webb would arrive. He'd examine the evidence. And if he decided the story was legitimate, the machinery of exposure would begin turning. There would be no going back after that. But as Rachel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time since inheriting the shop, since discovering the archive, since learning the truth about her grandfather's secret life, she felt like she was on the right path. Her phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. Stop. Whatever you're planning, stop now. This is your only warning. Walk away and stay safe. Continue and accept the consequences. Rachel stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. She'd made her choice. Let them come.